Welcome to this explainer. Okay, let's just dive right into it. We really tend to romanticize the founding of the American Republic, don't we? We picture this era of perfect unity and shared vision. But the reality? It was absolutely defined by volatile, dramatic, and sometimes violent conflicts over government power.
So you might be thinking, man, things are so polarized right now. But you might be surprised to learn that intense partisan divides, they are definitely not a modern invention. Actually, they started right inside George Washington's very first presidential cabinet. Literally almost from day one, Washington was struggling to keep the peace between two incredibly brilliant but just fundamentally opposed members of his administration.
Section 1. The Cabinet Divide. Washington's struggle began with an ideological tug-of-war that really set the stage for our first political parties.
Okay, so at the very core of this conflict were two completely opposing visions. On one side, you've got Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. He envisioned this active, powerful federal government promoting a bustling, metropolitan, commercial, and industrial society. But then on the exact opposite side, you have Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was deeply committed to restricting federal power to preserve a nation of small farmers and agriculture. Both men had Washington's ear, but they just fundamentally disagreed on what America should actually become.
Section 2. Hamilton's Financial Engine. Now, let's look at the financial system Hamilton built and how his specific policies acted as this massive action that triggered a fierce reaction. What's super interesting here is Hamilton's underlying philosophy. He genuinely believed that human self-interest was the single most powerful driver of human action. He wasn't really a fan of an equal distribution of property. Instead, he wanted to deliberately harness the desires of the wealthy. And his logic was pretty straightforward. If you tie the economic interests of wealthy Americans to the federal government's financial health, they're going to use their energy and influence to make sure that government survives and thrives. It's like building a built-in survival mechanism for the state.
Which brings us to a crucial point, this absolutely massive number. As the first part of his really ambitious financial plan, Hamilton proposed that the federal government assume responsibility for unpaid state debts left over from the Revolutionary War, and that totaled $25 million. Well, this immediately sparked outrage, especially among Southerners. A lot of them had already paid off their own state debts, so they furiously objected to being taxed again just to bail out states up in New England. Yet, despite this massive controversy, Washington and Congress backed Hamilton.
Next up on Hamilton's agenda was a proposal for a Bank of the United States. Now, Thomas Jefferson fiercely argued that this was unconstitutional, pointing out that the Constitution just didn't explicitly authorize it. But Hamilton managed to push it through by outlining its critical functions. It would hold federal funds, print paper money backed by physical gold or silver, which is known as specie, and it would control inflation. Crucially, though, 80% of it would be owned by private investors. This was Hamilton's vision of intimately connecting the government and wealthy men in action. It was designed to be an engine of business. But to Jefferson's supporters, it just looked like a tool to reinforce class boundaries and hand the rich way too much power.
Section 3. The Whiskey Rebellion. Because to pay for this grand financial engine, Hamilton needed taxes, and unrest quickly followed, leading to a literal armed domestic crisis. And the escalation happened so fast. Back in 1791, Hamilton proposed a federal excise tax on whiskey. For Western farmers, turning grain into whiskey was basically the only profitable way to get their crop to market, so this tax just completely devastated them. And the reaction was intense. By the fall of 1791, 16 men disguised in women's clothes assaulted, tarred, and feathered a tax collector. Fast forward to July 1794, and the unrest had escalated into a full-blown rebellion. We're talking 7,000 armed farmers gathering near Pittsburgh, robbing the mail, and burning down homes.
The dramatic climax arrived when President George Washington personally marched westward with an army of 13,000 militiamen. To this day, he remains the only sitting president to ever lead troops in the field. The farmers ultimately scattered, and the rebellion was crushed. But, while this overwhelming show of force proved the new federal government could maintain order, it also proved to poor Westerners that this new government was a genuine, literal threat to their livelihoods. Section 4. The French Connection. Next, let's examine how foreign policy became the ultimate domestic wedge issue, splitting the country even further apart. Okay, so initially, almost all Americans totally celebrated the French Revolution. But with the public execution of King Louis XVI, things quickly spiraled into the bloody Reign of Terror. You add in the arrival of a French ambassador known as Citizen Genet, a guy who actively tried to recruit Americans to attack Spanish colonies and literally threatened to appeal directly to the American people over Washington's head, and well, the Federalists were absolutely terrified.
They valued social stability above all else and saw the French Revolution as a descent into chaotic, dangerous mob rule.
On the other side, though, the Republicans remained incredibly loyal to France, and that's perfectly captured by this astonishingly extreme quote from Thomas Jefferson. I mean, despite the mounting body count and the ruthless purge of enemies happening in France, Jefferson wasn't deterred at all. He basically declared he'd rather see half the earth desolated than see the revolution fail. This really highlights just how deeply these two American factions were ideologically divided over what liberty actually meant in practice.
These boiling tensions finally came to a head over trade and naval conflicts. After Washington officially declared neutrality, he sent John Jay to London to negotiate a treaty. Jay managed to secure an agreement that protected American prosperity by favoring trade with Britain. But to Jefferson's Republicans, this was seen as outright treachery. In their eyes, the Federalists had effectively sided with the British monarchy over the new French Republic. The intense, bitter congressional debate over Jay's treaty is actually what officially transformed these loose factions into the United States' first two distinct organized political parties, the Federalists and the Republicans.
Section 5. Security and Sedition. All of this brings us to a boiling point under our second president, John Adams, where foreign paranoia led to some seriously dangerous federal overreach.
When John Adams took office, he stepped right into a massive foreign crisis. France, still furious over Jay's treaty, was actively attacking American ships. When Adams sent diplomats over to negotiate, French officials, who were later codenamed X, Y, and Z, demanded a bribe just to start talking. To Americans, it felt like their young nation was being mocked and plundered by the French. When the public finally found out about this XYZ affair, it sparked absolute outrage and a massive wave of Francophobia all across the country.
This famous rallying cry swept the nation. Paranoia was quite literally everywhere. People down in Charleston were watching the horizon, terrified of a French naval invasion or violent uprisings sparked by covert agents. Children were even fighting with sticks in the streets, getting ready for a war. And up in New England, a minister actually sparked widespread panic with a complete hoax that the French Revolution was a conspiracy driven by a secret anti-Christian group called the Illuminati. It was total chaos.
So in the name of national security during this sort of quasi-war with France, the Federalists in Congress passed these frankly shocking laws. The Alien Act allowed the government to deport foreign nationals who were deemed a threat. But the Sedition Act was even more dramatic. It essentially made it a federal crime to criticize the president or the government. Federalists justified this by arguing that licentious, meaning recklessly irresponsible or unruly speech, actually made society less free. And they weren't bluffing. They actively used the law to prosecute Republican printers and even threw a sitting congressman in jail.
Section 6. The Cracked Foundation. Finally, let's look at the monumental backlash to this federal overreach and how it fundamentally tested the Constitution itself.
The Sedition Act triggered an immediate and profound constitutional crisis. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson actually secretly authored resolutions that were then adopted by the legislatures of Virginia and Kentucky. These resolutions didn't just argue for an expansive new vision of free speech. They made the incredibly bold claim that the national government was strictly limited, and that states basically had the power to declare federal laws unconstitutional. This planted a highly controversial seed of state-level defiance, a cracked foundation really, that would go on to haunt the country throughout the entire 19th century.
We'll wrap up this explainer with this profound, entirely unresolved question straight from the 1790s. The debates over Hamilton's finances, the Whiskey Rebellion, the French Revolution, and the Alien and Sedition Acts, they were all just early battlegrounds for this exact question. Is America supposed to be rooted in a radical, universal vision of human liberty? Or is it supposed to prioritize traditional order and stability? When you look at the political headlines today, you really have to ask yourself, have we ever actually answered that question? Or are we still just fighting Washington's cabinet battles?